it possible to delegate someone in like this front row to help me keep an eye on the Victoria channel? I don't see questions there. A slight nod from over here. This my guy? Alright. Alright. Diffuse responsibility. I like it. Well, you're supposed to do that anyway. But you're right, when it's Victoria, you feel more like I gotta get this in right now. I know you're in the middle of a sentence, but this seems urgent. Cool. I think that's the camera I want. Yeah, good. I just want to do a sound check before I get everybody's attention to see if Victoria can hear me okay. Super cool. Okay, because I switched back to the clip mic. The clip was broken, so I brought a binder clip from home. And with practice, you too can be an engineer. So I just wanted to make sure that it was working. And if it like drifts or something, let me know so I can fix it. Today's lecture is entitled Responsive Design and SaaS. We're going to talk like a very little bit about SaaS if I don't forget at the end. Mostly I want to talk about responsive design, and I want to kind of wrestle that into what I hope is useful for you guys, talking about doing layout in CSS and just kind of like how do you wrangle all your boxes to do the right thing, and how should you think about that? And I think starting with responsive design is a useful way to kind of frame that conversation about how do you want to write all of your CSS. Because a common place that people get stuck is, this happens a lot with designers who came from print and then want to design for the web, is you think of your CSS as like a static thing. You picture like the boxes that that you're making, that you like maybe you draw on the whiteboard when you're wireframing or on a piece of paper or something. You think of those as like static things, and they're not. If you're building like a landing page, something with very static content, it's possible that you know that this is supposed to be 400 pixels and I don't care what screen it's on. But if you're building dynamic web apps, like if you're building like a tweeter or something, then the layouts that you build have to be flexible. They have to look good on a variety of devices. They have to look good with a variety of content. So the layout has to be able to accommodate 0 characters or maybe 1 character. It needs to be able to accommodate up to 140. And then you've made like a conscious decision that my layout doesn't have to accommodate anything larger than 140 characters. But within those parameters, it's very flexible. When somebody uploads an image as their avatar, which is not a feature you're building, but hopefully you kind of think about that stuff, you want to be able to like throw in an image, and they throw in like a big JPEG that's like weird proportions and stuff, and you want your CSS to be able to accommodate that. In that particular example, you might have like some server-side image manipulation that like crunches it down into like smaller size and more reasonable proportions. But the point still stands that you want to be able to make rules about how your CSS works that are going to be able to accommodate kind of unpredictable content and unpredictable contexts. I'm just going to pause for a second for effect on that. Thank you. Now, that said, usually when people ask you about responsive design, like if you're in an interview and someone says, what do you think about responsive design? A good answer is, well, I think websites should look good on mobile as well as on desktop. That's a pretty good like basic answer, and a lot of the time when we're talking about responsive design, that's what we're talking about. Is like different screen sizes and different devices. Yep.
I've seen a lot of websites now shift from actually having completely different mobile sites from their full regular site that
You've seen different websites have like totally different um, designs, totally different.
yes, and some
Yeah,
features are missing on mobile sites. You can't access some features.
some of the features are missing on the mobile sites. Yeah, yeah, for sure. I have uh, Wikipedia Mobile. Mobile is an example here. If you look at, sure, this will work. If you grab like some random Wikipedia page and put the mobile version, I'm just for those of you that don't know, if you just put this, it's hard to read. If you put this M in the URL, it'll give you the mobile version. And what the Wikipedia servers do is they look at your user agent in the HTTP request, which I'm sure you're all super familiar with. And they check to see if they think you're on mobile, and then they send you to, they redirect you to the mobile site instead of the main site. So this is the same page. This is what you see on mobile. And this is what you see on desktop. So the desktop view has a whole bunch more stuff on it, right? So in this case, they've actually created like very different, like if you look at the source code, it's going to be very different. If you look at the HTML hierarchy, most of the content is going to be, you're going to see a lot of overlap, right? We see like a heading and a bunch of paragraph text and an image over here. And then we go back over here to the same section and we see a heading, but now it has some like different behavior, right? That's not just CSS though. It's like someone wrote some JavaScript and you're getting like different code. But it's the same content it's like mostly the same content. You have this contents box that is analogous to this contents box. Like it might be literally the exact same content because they have to generate all this dynamically, right? But they're very different views. And so you're missing that sidebar, except no, you're not. It's in this hamburger over here. It has, hear Nima noises from the other room. It's pretty distracting. Um, but yeah, they had a lot of stuff in this hamburger menu over here. And yeah, to your point, they serve you like an entirely different site, right? And that's one of the approaches we're going to talk about here. But before we get into that, I think we want to think about not just web or mobile. We want to think of it sort of like as more of a spectrum of different contexts that you could have it in. So what's cool about Wikipedia Mobile is that it looks good on like my full width desktop. It looks good at half window width. It does something reasonable. If I make it even narrower, it still looks reasonable. And if I go into my Magic Mobile view, it still looks good, right? So that's the thing that we really want to nail. I think making the decision to serve entirely different code, depending on the user agent, is a big decision. That's a lot more work. And in a way, it reduces our flexibility to be able to serve many different devices because we have, like small screens, large screens, just on desktop that are going to be running like the same version of Firefox that I'm running, but just on different contexts on different operating systems. So we can tackle this problem from like a few different levels. Does that make sense? Does that answer your not question?
Yeah, I think
So yeah, let's talk about this stuff, our different approaches. So we kind of want to think about when we're building layouts, what sort of rules we're defining. How do you translate what you have in mind or you have like on a piece of paper or that like, a mock-up a designer gave you like this? How are you going to translate that into code, into living, breathing HTML and CSS? And how are you going to make that look good on like, this is going to be like a terrible mobile view, right? How are you going to make this look good when there are 8 buttons in this nav menu, or like 22 in this sidebar. What about when there's only one item here? Is like this other stuff gonna like squish up? So that's not the thing I was going for. Go ahead.
Isn't that already bad design to have more than like 5 to 7 items?
Oh, isn't this already bad design?
If you have like 10 items in like a physical like a sidebar, it's already bad design.
I don't think so. I think if you look at documentation for some software library, and this is like all different methods or different modules or something, you're gonna get a sidebar with like hundreds of items, and it's gonna have to like it's gonna scroll, and you're gonna be able to filter and sort, hopefully. But are documentation sites built for user interface? Well, yeah, because users use them. They're for users. I you're gonna have like a rough time in your dev career if you don't find some documentation you like. Yeah, I mean, people put like a lot of effort into making documentation ergonomic and straightforward to use for like well-maintained software projects. Documentation for a lot of projects is like famously bad, but then there's documentation that's really good. Like PyDocs are really good. Python documentation is really good. And they use this metaphor of like the sidebar for navigation for like React Router. The React Router docs do this too. I'll pull that up real quick because I think it's cool. So they have this scrolling sidebar with all this stuff that React Router can do, and in just like a few little finger wags, I can get an overview of like everything that React Router does. You have your actual documentation here, and then the relevant code here. I've spent a lot of time with these docs, and I find it really easy to navigate, really traversable. I do agree with you that this particular layout looks pretty busy. I would caution against just like jamming stuff in there because it gets messy. But I think it looks kind of like the BBC website, right? It's kind of like a similar number of boxes. It feels kind of busy. It is kind of busy because there's a lot going on in the world. But yeah, I guess I don't particularly endorse this specific design. Yeah, so we're going to talk about a few different plans for making your apps responsive. One is you can just like bring in a tool that just gives you automatic responsivity, like Bootstrap. A lot of people kind of take the approach of like, I'm just going to use Bootstrap and it's going to handle responsive for me. That's like kind of true. I hope if you're the sort of person that just like, I'm not going to write CSS in my career. I hate it. I'm going to stay away from that. I want to just sink into the back end and pull a curtain in front of me. Then like that's a reasonable approach. You can get stuff done that way. For those of you who are more keen about building user interfaces and being able to like get the browser to do what you want, and you have more nuanced ideas to express, we can do better than that. So the thing that you were talking about is what we call adaptive design. That's where you serve different code based on something like the user agent. Like, I want this to look like this on this device, so I send them over this bundle of code, this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then on this other device, no, we don't do that. That's going to look horrible. Send them this thing instead. The other approach is we can be serving them one piece of content, but use media queries to style it differently based on things like viewport width. And then I think the place that we want to start is with fluid layout. So the page, like each individual box on the page knows what you want it to do in terms of like how it should grow and shrink, and negotiate space with its parent, children, and neighbors. And that's where we reach for tools like Flexbox. Flexbox is like our sword and shield for that kind of thing. So I'm going to show you kind of an example of what I mean here with respect to these rules that every box is playing by. So I have a bunch of little paragraphs here. These are all p tags. They're just styled to look like boxes, and they look identical right now, but each one is different. Can you spot the difference? Correct, there is no difference. Or at least not that you can see. The difference is these are going to behave differently based on the content that we put in. So if you got something like this as a design in a mock-up or something, maybe you created it yourself, and then you decided that this copy needs to change, whoa, now you don't know what's going to happen, right? So if we add more text here, I just duplicate the line. They all kind of do different things. They don't look the same anymore, right? So what's going on? We got up here, it goes fine, and then it wraps on this word, and then down here it wraps on this word. And that's sort of strange. Here it just overflows kind of out forever, and then you can see just like a little bit of like the edge of the page, right? If I had another one, it's even more exacerbated. It just pushes everything off. So down here, these are these get cut off. The difference here between these two is this one will scroll. This one will not. This one says, no, you're just not allowed to see that content anymore. That stuff is missing. You can't even highlight it. This one scrolls horizontally, or we might make the decision to scroll vertically. I'm going to delete this one because it's actually breaking my page. If I add one more, I just want to get that like nice horizontal, vertical scroll. So each of these boxes, when it has like the predicted content, it looks the same. So you put in like your lorem ipsum text or whatever, and you go, look, I'm done. It looks good. It looks great. And then like probably inevitably some user is going to come along, or some like coworker is going to come along, probably your boss, and be like, well, what if I just add 3 more characters there, and the whole layout just like boom. Yeah, I see some nods. You've been there. What can you remember the specific thing that went wrong? Yeah, stuff just pushes other things out of the way in kind of like an unpredictable way, and then it's sort of this runaway avalanche of like floats kind of flowing around each other, and yeah. So when we use floats and clears and things, mostly floats, for layout, we're really signing ourselves up for like, kind of trying to make like a castle out of water. It's it's a real mess. But we don't have to do that anymore, right? Because something like, how many of you right now are using Flexbox in your project? A little bit? All right. How many of you feel like you really have a handle on Flexbox? Good. I saw like a shrug that came up to about here. That's good. I want to spend a lot of today talking about Flexbox, because I think that's really like, if you're trying to build layouts and you don't know how to use Flexbox, you're gonna have a rough time. So I kind of want to like deal with some of the high-level concept stuff. It's It's going to help you like understand that like CSS tricks article and sort of frame how to like build your own layouts out of it. So yeah, what we're talking about today, we want to deal with that problem of all these sort of implied behind the scenes rules that your elements are playing by. This one doesn't have any style rules at all that I've imposed on it. But it still has all this behavior because the browser has all of these defaults, right? And what do the browser's default behaviors kind of orient themselves around? Well, it's what HTML is for. HTML is for writing academic documents, these long, kind of like nicely formatted, like I want like a heading and then some body text and a bulleted list and like maybe an image of like, some chart or something like that. And I want it to be like easy to write, easy to maintain, look good on a variety of devices. Like I should be able to print an HTML document to my terminal and it'll like look reasonable. At least back in the day when it was being conceived. And I should maybe have a table in there. Maybe we could support tables one day, and then they did. And but yeah, HTML is about text. It wants you to pretend that like all of your documents are text, right? And then when we start saying like, well, I want like a header, like a nav bar or something, then the standard default way of doing HTML is like, okay, but like what kind of paragraph? Is that like a paragraph? Is that like, oh, that's kind of like a heading, right? Yeah, we could make it like a heading. No, it's not really like a heading. It's like boxes. It's like buttons and like some over here and some over here, and this one should have like a drop down. And you're like speaking different languages with respect to that like academic document model that HTML is kind of designed for. That's why we call it the document object model, right? And not like the application object model or something. So if I find that if I think of the DOM as sort of like, I'm kind of like adding programming, like I'm adding like code to a PDF or something, that helps me kind of like take a step back and be like, okay, yeah, I see what's going on here. This thinks that I'm trying to make like an academic document right now, and I need to override all of that. Does that make sense? And Flexboxes are planned for that. So before we jump into that, I want to go through like a few examples of these sites, all of which handle responsive in like their own kind of way. I want to look at a few of the things, like I just want to like analyze these for the behavior that they have, particularly at different viewport sizes. And we're going to take a second to just kind of prime the pump and like notice what's going on there. And that'll help us later on when we're talking about Flexbox. So this is, I forget what this site is. Oh yeah. This is some random e-commerce site, happens to be for an electric longboard. And we have like some like copy and then some images over here, some more images in like a row, and then we have like some image, text, image. Pretty standard stuff, right? Pretty short. First thing I want you to notice is that there's like a content hierarchy here. There's like content that's more important on the page, and there's content that's less important. What's the most important thing on the screen right now? The video. How do you know? Because it's the biggest, yeah, and it's moving. That's a good point. We don't usually talk about that, but like motion is very eye-catching, right? Is there? Can we go further than that? Is there a second most important thing? Third most? Nav bar in the header. This one here. What about this one here? Which one's more important? Okay. Can you zoom in a little bit?
I mean, I would probably say that my eye goes to the logo before it goes to the very top nav.
Your eye goes to the logo, and then it goes over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So like one heuristic we can use for importance is like kind of like how far up on the page it is and how far to the left it is. Right. So like if you study like people's like the way people read, especially like a web page, particularly a web page, it like kind of follows this like F shape. you start in the top left and you kind of read, and then you get to like kind of the middle of the page. Most people don't even go all the way to the end of the line if they're skimming. You get to about the middle of the page and then kind of jump down to the next thing. So start reading in this like kind of ever narrowing upside down pyramid, kind of like an F. So yeah, I agree. I think this this navbar is more important, and this one is kind of secondary, and that makes sense. These are the things that sell boards and make them money, and these are the things that they feel obligated to do, and you want them there, but they're not as important. So what do you think is going to happen when space becomes more scarce? When we shrink the window here?
I think the orange bar items are going to become like a hamburger. And I think they're going to try and prioritize the like video and the flash.
Orange items are going to become a hamburger, and they're going to prioritize the video, and they're going to prioritize the logo and this part of the header. Yeah. So even before that, I think that's exactly where we want to be thinking in terms of like the design of the page, in terms of like the engineering of the page, right? Like if you picture yourself in like the room where the layout algorithm is running, and you're like turning the cranks yourself. Like every time you resize the window, like the page has to recalculate what it looks like, right? And everything has to renegotiate its space. Let's also try to notice like where the space gets consumed. Like, is it from the margin between items? Is it from the space between the items? Is it the margin on the edges? Do things shrink, or do they stay the same size and just move closer together, right? That's the sort of thing that I want to pay attention to with this navbar here. So shrink, shrink. So it's interesting because like right away there's like this little hop with the menu items, where they decide we don't need that margin anymore. That can go. And then we start chewing away at that space in the center. And like you almost don't notice this, right? Like you really have to be thinking about like, you have to be thinking like pretty under the hood to even notice that we're recalculating the number of pixels between these two items. And that's the thing, that's the number that's reducing, and these other numbers are staying static. But yeah, that's what's happening. We're just chewing away at, I was hoping I'd get to the end of that sentence before that next hop. But yeah, that's pretty close to your suggestion that they're going to hide the menu items behind a hamburger. They're going to prioritize the video, which I think has just like stopped, like it ended or something. And they kept the logo, and then they hid these things behind a hamburger. They still have that same hierarchy, right? Like the important ones are up here, and the less important ones are down here. This is going to shrink, 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 shrink. Is there another hop, or is that it? Yeah. Okay. So the logo will get smaller as it runs out of space, but that's about it. And this copy, of course, breaks gracefully. So to what extent that was like design genius on the part of like the people who built like probably the template that this company used, and to what extent that was just, you know, the browser doing what the browser does, is like sort of hard to gauge, right? Like there are all these behaviors that the browser just does for you. If they work for you, you just keep them. You don't touch them. If they're not working for you, then we think about like how are you going to kind of redesign that sort of thing. So let me ask you all, do you want to look at another example, or do you want to talk about how to build a navbar with Flexbox? Navbar? Okay. Is that big enough? Doesn't really matter how big this is. I'm just going to touch a new, I don't know. You can do it too.
What?
Yeah.
Shut the front door.
Anyone can clear their terminal. I taught my mom to clear her terminal. I'm saying you can do it. Do you know this one? Use Atom as a text editor. You know what that's going to do?
We're gonna find out.
Yeah, we're going to find out. So what that does, this shows what that expression evaluated to. And what, maybe some of you have come across like that before. Is that familiar to anyone? So that just means take the last command, like if I press up, what I get there, take that last command and add sudo to it. So sudo my last command. If I go sudo, this isn't going to make as much sense, so I'll go back to Atom. If I go bang bang, then what I get is like Atom foo.html. But if I go bang $, it means execute the last, or evaluate to the last argument that I passed. So if I want to do like something like the same thing to a bunch of files, I can go, let's see, I had Atom foo.html, I can go cat, bang $, I can go rm, bang $, now it's gone. Oops. So I want it back so I can touch bang $. It didn't work because I just did ls. Okay. Does that make sense? That's a cool trick. It's a good one. And I'm going to, I don't know if you know this one, but you can just use open on an HTML file. And usually your computer is smart enough to go ahead and put that in your browser. You can do that with folders. So like if I want to open this folder in Finder, I can go open dot for current directory. I'll open that up in Finder for me. Just do a whole lecture on terminal pro tips. So when I new up an HTML file like this, I kind of think, does anyone watch like Bob Ross? Yeah, I see a few nods. No, he's not around unfortunately, but like a bunch of his stuff is on Netflix now. So I find it really relaxing to put on some Bob Ross, and I don't paint, but I just, yeah, I find it relaxing to watch him paint. So if you watch, Bob Ross build up a painting, he starts with like a blank canvas or a canvas that has like some basic treatment on it. So we're gonna go use that HTML macro that Atom has. Just go HTML. Oh, there's a thing that does. Go style. We're going to make this a nice blanched almond. And I like to do this just to make sure that when I save something in this file and then refresh the page, something happens. Okay, good, we're in business. It's like if you watch Bob Ross like build up a painting, he kind of does this, he does like the broad strokes, and he does sort of like we have a thing up here and a thing down here, and then we're going to add some detail. Then we're going to add some finishing touches, and here's just a little trick that I like. So that's how I approach building a new page that I've never worked on before, like where I'm starting from scratch. I like to kind of build like the main structure of the layout, and then I like to build like the inner parts of the layout, and then I put in the details. So that lends itself pretty well to building with Flexbox, as if I do a good job, you'll see in a minute. So let's say we want nav. We're just going to build a nav bar here. What element might we want to start with? Nav? Yeah, let's start with nav. Why can't we just use div here? Because there's an actual nav tag, yeah. So it's kind of a trick question. You can't just use divs for everything. But it's just kind of like calling your variables A, B, C, D, E in your JavaScript. It's like, let's give things more like semantic names so that it's easier to read. It's easier to just look at the source and figure out the hierarchy. Is that a question?
Yeah. You could.
Could what? Yes, I phrased the question like you can't use a div, and that was a trick. You can use a div, and a lot of the time you are using a div. And I think sometimes when you're building, it's like if you can't think of a semantic tag, and you kind of find yourself trying to like muscle this into like, this is sort of a nav. Can I just like use nav for this? Then maybe it's okay to reach for a div, because I think giving something a bad name, like a bad name that it's not obvious that it's bad, is worse than just giving it like an obviously not very meaningful name. Like giving it a misleading name, I guess, is worse than giving it just like a name that doesn't lead you anywhere. You're just like, I don't know, this is a div. I guess I'll have to read the code and figure it out. But yeah, in this case, we have a tag for that. So good. So how's this tag going to behave? It's going to behave as a block level element, because that's the default, right? All of your elements by default bin into either block level elements or inline elements. And that kind of goes back to that we're basically programming a PDF idea, right? Like a text document. A block level element is like things that should like stack like this. An inline element is like a piece of text that you're trying to like apply some styling to, right? That's kind of the intent of those. And of course, we use those in very different ways. So like commonly we use the metaphor like block level means vertical axis. Inline means horizontal axis. So that's why if we want like two things beside each other, we're like, oh, they need to be like inline block maybe? Yeah, okay, that works. So by default, this nav is going to be a block level element. What are we going to see when we refresh the page? Nothing. Why? We haven't applied any style, exactly. So if we go look at, see how big I can make my DevTools before it's unbearable. If we look at the nav bar, there's no styling in there, and I can hover over it, and you can see, I don't know how to zoom in on that without losing focus on the element. You can see at the top of the window, there's like this little thin line that indicates like, yep, it's there. It's just 0 pixels tall. That's because this element wants to be, because it's a block level element, it's going to be as wide as it's allowed to be. That's what block elements do. And it's going to be as tall as it needs to be for its content and no taller. And that's what this block level element is doing right now, right? If we change it to display inline, what do we suppose is going to happen? It becomes, you can see like these lines kind of on the left margin and the top margin. Those are just like pointing us to the element. Those are just like crosshairs that like narrow us into like where the element is. It's actually like 0 width now too. Because in the same way that a block level element is like, I'm going to be just as tall as I need to be for my content, but I'm going to be as wide as I can. An inline element says, I'm just going to be as wide and as tall as I need to be for my content, which is none. There's no content at all, right? We have 2 plans for overriding this. You can give it a width and a height. You can say, it's very nice of you to be frugal about the space you take up, but I insist that you take up like 40 pixels or something, right? So we can give it a width and a height. Or one more time. Or flexbox. I like where you're thinking, but we're not there yet. You can add content, exactly. So you can either tell it you're this wide or this tall, or you can add content. So let's go ahead and add our first button. Maybe an A tag. I don't think we want buttons, do we? Great, now it has content. Still nothing. Why not? Because the content doesn't have any content. The content is, the nav is a block level element, so it's taking up as much width as it can based on its parent, and as little height as it needs to fit its content. What type of element is this A tag? Sorry? It's an anchor, yeah. What display rule does it follow? What display rule do anchor tags follow by default?
Display whatever you put between the brackets. I'm not really sure.
So I'm asking kind of more abstractly. So if I frame it like, remember that like flow layout algorithm, which is like the text document algorithm. It's called flow. In the flow plan, we have block level elements and we have inline level elements. And like in terms of how they display, that's kind of the whole story. Kind of. So we can bin every HTML element into this either a block or it's an inline. So it's an inline, yeah. And if you didn't know that, you could tell because right now it's taking up, just in the top left corner there, it's taking up 0 width and 0 height. The maximum it needs to accommodate its content, which is none, right? So you have a block level element behaving like a block level element does, and an inline level element behaving as an inline does. Make sense so far? Is this too slow for anybody? I'm kind of really getting into the weeds here with this, but I feel like it's helpful to know how this works. So, but if you guys already know this, then we can pick it up. Question? Is 16 the font size? Probably what's going on is 16 is the default font size, yeah. We can probably look at my user agent styles. I don't know how to confirm that, but I think that's what's going on is it's going to default to like 1 M or 1 rem is going to equal 16. So it says it's 16, but that's actually kind of a lie, isn't it? Because the box it draws is still 0 by 0. So like that might actually even be a bug that it says 16. Yeah, your browser has bugs. Crazy. Yeah. So there are two things that we need to do to make this like look kind of more like a nav bar. One is that we need it to like stretch across the whole screen and have some height. And the other thing is we need it to be like visually distinguished from the rest of the page, right? So we have to make a decision about this nav bar. Is it gonna like, is it a container for its content, or is it like a region on the page, right? In this case, because it's a nav bar, we know that it's like a region on the page. Like if we draw like the mock-up, it's like we have this section that is the nav bar, and even if there's nothing in it, that's where the nav bar goes, right? So we're going to tell the nav bar, I have some special instructions for how you're supposed to render. Probably we want it to be full width. It's already full width in the block inline plan, right? Blocks are full width by default. We also want to give it some height. So how tall do we want it to be? Maybe using that font size observation you made as a hint. 100 pixels. Okay, see how that looks. Hey, it's 100 pixels now. Good job, everybody. We've got most of a nav bar. 100 pixels, but there's no color, right? So the default color is going to be inherit. The color that an element is based on what its parent is by default. So we're going to tell it, like, I know you like your parent's color, but we're going to make you a different color. Any suggestions? Honeydew? Do we have honeydew? I don't think we have honeydew. We do, okay. My text editor was wrong. Great, okay. Yeah, I think that looks good. So from this angle, I can't actually like really see that on the screen. Can you all see that clearly? Okay, can Victoria see that clearly? Give them a second to answer and just go with honeydew for now. But we'll change it if it's too hard to see. Maybe we can change that to like. Okay, cool. It's like gray. Okay, is that a little better? No, I think that's worse. Let's go to early wood. It's like darker blanched almond. Is that worse? No, it's better. That's better? Okay. So how's our nav bar looking? Progress. It's getting there. We got this annoying, like it's kind of like floating in space here. We want it to look like kind of like anchored to the top of the page, right? Like a ceiling tile. What's going on here? Yeah, it's got margin and padding. So your HTML document comes with some margin and padding built in. Great, because like you're probably writing an academic paper, right? And you want that. You want some built-in space so that your letters don't jam up against each other and someone makes like a terrible like inference error because they like messed up the ligatures or something. So you want some built-in padding. Pardon? They don't love the honeydew? Okay. Well, does Victoria have a suggestion for another color? Navy? Did they say maybe or navy?
It's the 80s again.
Why don't we make that burnt almond?
We'll go with navy for a bit. So we're all gonna live with that decision for a bit, and then we can always revisit that. Yeah. So something I love to do when I'm like picking colors is I'll just go through, like your dev tools have all the colors, and you can just go like, well, not all the colors, all the named colors. You can just kind of flip through them. This is the wrong element. I don't know why I'm doing that. You can just like delete that, and you have to select the element and then tab to the next one, and the box pops up. You can just kind of flip through them, which I'm not going to do. I'm in the middle of a lecture, but we'll leave that as navy for now.
Does CSS have any like color palettes? Like if you search Google for color palettes, they give you like a set of. I was wondering if there's like a built-in function for that, or
There's a built-in function for.
like color palettes. You have like your associated colors that all look good together, and so when you're designing a website, you don't have to like arbitrarily like, or you don't have to go to Google and say like, all right, let's look up the.
Oh, does CSS have any plan for like giving you like complementary colors? Not really. CSS has the plan that CSS has is you can pick any color you want, any color at all, even if they clash. That's up to you. That said, there are like lots of like Adobe has a great free online color palette generator. There are like a bunch of like coolers.com does the same thing, but CSS doesn't have any function that I know of that does that. So yeah, we were going to get rid of this terrible margin and anchor this nav bar to the top of the screen. I was saying that, yeah, your document comes with like all of this stuff built in, like this margin and padding. And often you don't want that, especially if the thing that you're trying to do is build a layout. You're not building you're not building like an academic paper. You're building like a user interface. So maybe I want to say thanks for the margin, but I think I'll pass. So something that I sometimes do in my projects is I'll do. Does anyone know what this does? Yeah, this selects all elements. All elements match this guy. So I'll often make the decision that I might come back and amend this decision later, but for now I just want like no margin, no padding, no funny business, right? So anything that I define as funny business gets overridden in here, and because it's that just match everything operator, it's super easy to override. Like almost anything overrides it. So do that, and now our nav bar like hits the top of the page. Cool. Doing pretty well. We probably want to add some stuff to it. We should probably have like, you know, logo, some nav buttons, and maybe like most nav bars have like a bunch of stuff over here and then a bunch of stuff over here, right? So they want to help me like brainstorm some stuff that can go in here. I don't know what kind of like nav bar we're pretending to make yet.
When is the button should be product?
Products? Okay. So we'll have a button that says products. Maybe we'll have 3 buttons that say products for now. But we'll rename them. What's another thing that goes with products? Sorry? Checkout? Okay. Something else? About us? Yeah, good one. Sorry? Cool. Nobody clicks on about us. I do that all the time. I want to like find out where like the company is located and stuff. Go check out the about us page. Or their contact page has like one of those annoying like just submit an email that and like maybe we'll reply to it ever forums. But you can go to like the about us page and they often have like their actual contact info on there. You can like email a person who has to look at it. So let's see how that looks. Wow, that's just something. Okay, oh yeah, so first of all, let's delete that. We don't need that anymore. And then we're going to replace this logo with an emoji. What emoji should we pick? Tooth? Okay. Yeah, cool. Wow. And we'll call that, let's call that a H1 just for fun. So that's good. My text editor doesn't like it, but my browser has no problem rendering the tooth. So now we're getting, what we're doing here is we're building out the HTML hierarchy first. We're building out the content hierarchy. And we're going to implement the layout hierarchy as kind of like a second pass, right? So we're just getting like all the content out there so we can look at it. I'm going to go ahead and change the color of the, I'm going to make the default color for everything just be like, I think Navajo white is like an off-white. Yeah, nice. It's a little easier to read on the navy. Not getting sick of that decision. No, actually, it works pretty well with the tooth, though, I think. It's a good dentistry color. Yeah, we're going to get all the content out there, and then we're going to think about, like, all right, now how do we style this guy? What other content might go on this snapbar? None? That's enough? Great, I think so, too. Let's continue. Let's fix my indentation here. So now, what do we want to happen here? We want I'm not going to mess with Zoom because like trying to like style and like work with Zoom at the same time I think is going to lead to madness. So we're just going to make the default font size be let's try 32 pixels. Yeah, that looks fine, right? Cool. Now we have a few problems. This could get better, right? Why is this tooth stacking on top of these links here? That's what does by default. So you're on the right track. Yeah, it's because it's a header, right? So what's the significance of it being a header? Sorry? It's usually like a title or something. Yeah, it's usually important on the page, right? And do you want your header like pinning its elbows to its ribs because there's like paragraph text all around it? No. You want your header to take up like the whole section, and underneath, that's where the text can go beneath the header. The header is important. It should be up high on its own. So the header is important. It's like a main chunk of page, right? Why are these lined up beside each other? Because these are inline elements, right? This is a block level element, right? So block level element says next block level element or inline element, you can go underneath me because I take up the full width, right? And then these are inline elements. They're happy to just be like, no, there's room. We can test that by going, change that to a span. That's a good inline element. Now they line up beside each other, right? And in fact, if we want to override that behavior with H1s, we can just tell it it's an inline element. That rule doesn't apply anymore, and we get the same effect, right? So with HTML, it has these sensible defaults, but you can always override them. So if you want that to be an H1 because you want that to be like, this means what it means to be an H1, this is like the most important piece of text on the page. But I don't want that block behavior, no problem. You can keep the semantic meaning of the H1, but then just change the way it displays. But we're not going to do any of that because we're just going to change layout algorithms. We're just going to change plans. So I'm going to tell my navbar, I want you to treat your content not as like a text document, but as just like boxes that I want you to line up in a row. I'm alluding, of course, to Flexbox. Thank you. So perhaps you're familiar with this. Your page layout is broken. You don't know why. You display Flex, and everything's good again. Cool. So what happened? We noticed that we got like a similar effect to like when we turned the H1 into an inline element. Everything just like lined up beside the other stuff, but not for the same reason, right? What's going on now is not that we turned it into the kind of text that knows that it's okay to just sidle up beside some other text. It's because these elements are no longer laid out as text. They're laid out as boxes. Flexbox thinks of them as in terms of boxes. How wide are the boxes? I don't know. Let's ask the boxes. The box goes, how wide am I? I don't know. Let's ask my content. The content goes, how wide am I? Well, let's see. I contain this string, and I'm supposed to be this font size, and that means I take up this many pixels. And then it reports to the box. I would like to be this many pixels. And it reports to the parent. I would like to be this many pixels. And the parent goes like, let me see what I can do. That's the Flexbox layout algorithm in a nutshell. But of course, we can also do that with just like telling things how big they are, right? That's weird. I thought that would work. Background color. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. Whew. Yeah. What's the mistake I made here? What's color control? Font color. Yeah. Good. I'm glad at least one person, two people in this room knew that because I forgot. So we can just tell elements how big they are. And in this case, what the nav element is doing is asking these boxes how big they are. It asks this plum-colored box, how big are you? It says, let me go ask my content. Oh, I don't have any content. Let me see if I have any relevant styles. Oh, I do. Okay. I've been instructed to be 30 by 30. Can we make that work? And the parent says, let me see what I can do. So yeah, with text, it's like it works that way. With images, the image has a size it wants to be, and so it's going to try to tell its container that I would like it at least this much room. And of course, we can always just like define that manually. So let's get rid of that for now. I switch text editors like every couple days, so I always like get the wrong hotkeys for a little bit. Okay, so I think I want a little more. I'm going to tell every child of a nav element. Remember how I turned off all the margin and padding? I'm going to say if you're a direct descendant of a nav element, I don't care what specifically you are, but I want you to have a margin of 4 pixels. Maybe 8 pixels. Cool. And we're going to really start getting our money's worth for Flexbox here with pushing around these elements, right? It's nice when you have a layout tool that just lets you like put stuff where you want it, right? So with the flow algorithm, we kind of have to trick it. We kind of have to trick our content to go where we want it. It's like when you're using like floats and clears, it's like you kind of build like these elements that are like this wide or whatever, and then you kind of have to go like, come on, flow into here, good, and then like you change like the size of something by a couple pixels, and it goes like, no, I don't, it's too narrow, I'm scared. Okay. With Flexbox, you don't have to do that. With Flexbox, it's like pretty straightforward to push elements around the way you want it to. And then when you run into a situation where Flexbox doesn't support that layout, you can solve it with more Flexboxes, which is what we're going to see in a sec. So we want this stuff centered vertically. Let me back up for a sec. So with Flexbox, we have the concept of the main axis and the cross axis. Is anyone familiar with those terms? Is that term new to anyone? Are those terms new to anyone? Okay. So the thing to know about Flexbox in terms of like the axes is Flexbox's plan is to line things up in a row or line things up in a column. It lines them up along one axis, right? There's no way to say like I want this element here and this element here and then this element down there with Flexbox. That's what grid is for. With Flexbox, we're just going like just make a row of things. Just make a row of things. Just make a row of things like that. That's it, or a column. And so if you like add an element here and here and here, and then like you want to know where another element is gonna line up, you measure the cross axis. And you don't, the browser does, but like you look at, or no, sorry, main axis. Wow. You look at the main axis. The main axis is where like the next thing is gonna line up. The cross axis is the opposite axis. So in this case, if we add more elements here, we're gonna get, you know, they're gonna line up along the same axis. So we want to align our stuff on the cross axis. And the way to do that is to tell each item that it should align in a certain way. So we're going to use the align items property on the navbar. In general, for like aligning things in a Flexbox, you apply those styles to the Flex container. So in this case, we're going to tell the navbar, this is how I want you to arrange your boxes. We're not going to tell the boxes, this is how I want you to arrange. Does that make sense? You can, in some circumstances, tell individual items how they're going to arrange, but like usually that's not how we think about it. Yeah, we'll leave it there. So we're going to go align items. We just want them in the center. So that's looking pretty good. And when I'm playing with these properties, I always like to go back into my dev tools and just like tab through like what do these different positions look like. I think this is how you learn CSS. This is how you discover things, With your dev tools, CSS is very discoverable. And you, like, even before you, even if you don't go, like, look at the spec and read about what the algorithms are and, like what the designers had in mind, you develop an intuition just by running through, like, these different things that a flex box or, like, whatever can do. That particular property can take as values. So I've concluded that center is what I actually want, but it's still fun to flip through them and just be like, here are the other options that Flexbox gives me. Fun and profitable. So yeah, now as far as aligning things like along the main axis, we have some options too. We can justify content. So the difference between content and items, like why does it justify content but align items? It's because we think of, when we justify content, we're thinking about like taking all the boxes, shoving them to one side or the other. When we're aligning the items, each item is kind of like figuring out where it is going to go individually. So it's just a thing that you have to remember, that you usually what you want is justify content, align items. So what are our options for justify content? Let's have a look. We have center. Actually looks kind of good, better than I thought. End, flex start. End and flex end are just kind of like different words for the same thing. Interesting. Cool. So I think this is, the default is basically what I want here, except I think it would make a lot of sense if the checkout button was over here. Right? Does that make sense? How are we going to do that? Cliffhanger, I'm going to tell you after the break. All right, everybody, we're going to get back into it. I'm just figuring out how to get eyes on this whiteboard for Victoria, but we're about to jump back in. Zoom on this. Cool. Okay. All right. All right, I'm going to try to use this whiteboard for the next thing. If that's too hard for you to see in Victoria, make the whiteboard navy. Yeah, I can make this navy. I don't know if you'll like it though. Is that better? No, I don't think you want navy, do you? All right, so we're going to talk about, I just do the same thing twice. We're going to be talking a little bit about how to get this nav bar to do the thing we want here, which is how do we get things on both sides of, like how do we get this pushed apart effect, right? So this is where we are, and we know that we can align the contents of, so this is our flex container, right? If you're only going to tune in for like 30 seconds of this lecture, like just open your brain up and take in these terms. Make your Googling way easier. It'll make it a lot easier to figure out what's going on. You can just like really latch onto these terms. This box, the navy box that is our entire nav bar, that's our flex container. The flex container is the thing that has the property display flex on it. As soon as something becomes a flex container, everything inside of that stops following that like text document flow algorithm, and it starts following the flexbox layout algorithm. The flexbox layout algorithm starts with, first, treat all of my children as boxes. Flex items. So regardless of whether, in their last job, these were block level or inline level or whatever, now they're flex items, full stop. You lose that context of like, this is a block, this is inline, this is block inline block. That goes away, you're just a flex item now. Why? Because your flex container is your parent is a flex container. So a flex container can arrange its flex items on one axis. What's that axis called? The main axis, very good. Along the main axis, things are arranged, and we can move things along the main axis. We can decide how they distribute, right? So we don't just have to stack them like a queue at a grocery store, at like, the cash registers over here, and everybody's lining up like that. That's the default, is that they'll arrange it that way. We can change that. We can put the cash register over here. Everything will shift over there. And what property controls that? Not float. Remove float from your vocabulary. There's no floating in Flexbox. You're never going to want to float again once you get the hang of Flexbox. So when we're aligning things along the main axis, we're justifying. So it doesn't mean the same thing that it means with, like Microsoft Word. Justify and align don't mean those things here. When we say justify, we mean align things along the main axis. When we say align, we mean align things along the cross axis. And I wish I had a different word than align for that. So we can justify everything at the start of the flex box, in other words, where the head of the line is, or we can justify everything at the end of the flex box. We can justify everything in the center, or we can space things out. Flexbox is pretty good about going, well, I have 800 pixels here and only 4 flex items. Why don't we just spread everything out? You can have as much elbow room as you want. Kick your feet up. Instead of jamming up together and like relying on your margin to get your elbow room. So one property that seems relevant here when we want to like push everything apart is the space around property. Let's see what happens when we add some space around. That's not quite what we want, right? Because the thing is, we want these 3 items to kind of bunch together. We want these 3 to cluster, and it's this one that we want to move down this way, right? So we kind of think like, well, can I ask that item maybe like it can just like justify itself? Is that a thing? I can tell these to these to just chill out. No, it doesn't work. The reason being that justify, you can't really override justify because it's like the container controlling that, right? The container is saying like, I have a plan, I know where you're supposed to line up, there's a seating plan here. So you can't justify an individual item, you can only justify all of the content. So we need a new plan. Now the way that we approach this is by nesting flex boxes, right? So we know that if we have just 2 items, let's say I just have my tooth and checkout, and you don't know what you're checking out, but it has something to do with teeth. Question? You can't see the screen? Oh yeah, because I'm switching between. Of course I can. Okay, let's switch back to the screen. Please let me know if I do that again, because I will. Okay, so just to rewind here for Victoria, we had our we had like a bunch of stuff in here, and we were playing with justify. So we thought maybe like I know that the properties that push things apart are space around, space between, and space evenly. And so we tried space around, and we got this. We got everything's like kind of evenly distributed, but we don't really want that. We want these 3. The tooth and about us and products to kind of cluster up against one side, and the checkout to cluster against the other side. So I went, well, what if we could simplify this and we just have the tooth and the checkout? That's not bad. The thing we're running into now is that space around isn't exactly what we want. What space around does is it takes it divides all of the elements evenly and gives them half as much space as you put between the element you put on the margins. So it's like you get some elbow room with space around. Space evenly is kind of the same thing, except the amount of space you get on the margins is equal to the amount of space that you have between elements. So it's the most uniform of the space out plans. What we really want here is space between, which says just push these elements out as far as they're willing to go, out to the very, very edges, which turns out to be what we want here. And we can always bring these back in with some margin. This is why I hate using margin for layout, by the way. Like to say like, what if we just do margin 100% or something just to push this thing over there? Now that you're using margin for layout, you can't use margin to just kind of like nudge things in a particular direction, right? You want to save your margin for when you really just want like 4 pixels there. You don't want like 100% plus 4 pixels and like have to like do all that math and keep track of all those things. Like even if you're good at the math, like just your CSS gets really complicated when you're trying to like remember, oh yeah, this margin actually controls like 2 or 3 or 4 things. We want to let the layout algorithm do our layout and then use the margin for just like those finishing touches, like the shading on the happy little trees, right? Let's call back to the Bob Ross analogy from earlier. Thank you. So this is what we want, and this more or less matches this layout that we're going for. Should I just had like a clicker that I could like switch back and forth between whiteboard and. Yeah, I'm gonna switch back to whiteboard. Yeah. So now with like just when we just have the two elements, we get more or less this thing we want. Except it's just like these two elements. We haven't figured out how to get them in there yet. But we can have nested flex boxes, right? We can have like a flex item doesn't have to be like a text node or like an individual piece of content. A flex item can be a whole section of page, right? It can be a whole like grouping of other elements, right? So if it's true that you know, we can just take two items and push them like you're all the way on the left, you're all the way on the right, then it must be true that we can group these elements together. And for this parent, instead of thinking of it as like I have 1, 2, 3, 4 flex children, and I'm gonna distribute them like all on the left except for one. From the perspective of this flex parent, from the perspective of the nav bar, just have 2 flex children. Is this making sense? So now we have another semantic concept that we're going to add to our markup. So we flip back to, okay, getting the hang of this. So we flip back to our source code here. Look at this nav bar now. We are going to add an HTML element that means this is a meaningful group. It's meaningful to group these things together and not this other thing. So I'm going to go. We can just call this a div. I think this is like appropriate use of div is to say semantically all this is a division of 2 different chunks of content. So what we've done is we've taken 1, 2, 3 elements, we've wrapped them in a div. So now from the perspective, like we can fold those up. Y'all seen text folding before? It's my favorite text editor feature. We can fold those up, and now we can look at just from the nav level. The nav now has 2 children instead of 4. Oops. So we can implement this layout from the whiteboard now. Well, let's make it official with that justify content. What's the property to push everything as far apart as possible? Space between. You're gonna have to leave. That's 3 strikes, my friend. So now we throw that space between in there, and if we look at what's going on just by like hovering in the DOM here, I think doing this like mouse over thing to see like where the boxes are is like the quickest way to figure out what's going on with your CSS. Like you just sort of like blur your eyes and like stop looking at the content, and you just focus on the boxes. And that more often than not tells most of the story. Then you can narrow it down to, well, either the parent's giving it some weird instructions or it has some weird instructions, so let's drill into that. You just go in here and you start like flicking off properties and going, no, it's not that, it's not that. Anyway. So now we look at the nav bar. The nav bar looks like the box. It's like the you know, the Navajo white Bob Ross background that, you know, we're going to like add a happy, relaxing sunset to. And then we look at these boxes here, and we see like there's a box here and a box here. And so from Flexbox's perspective, or from the nav bar's perspective, it just has 2 flex items. Bit of a problem though, right? You see it? What is it? Yeah, the tooth has mounted the about us and products elements again. Why'd it do that? I thought we talked about this. What's going on? Hmm? It's in a div, and the div has it's applied the default layout algorithm to its children, right? So Flexbox, this is important. Flexbox only applies, it's a relationship between the parent and the direct children. So just because this is a flex item doesn't mean that its children are going to be flex items. And you actually don't want that, right? Because you might have a flex child that's actually supposed to be just like paragraph tags, right? Or it might be like a CSS grid, or it might be like some other, probably just those two actually. Yeah. But yeah, you don't have any guarantee. Like Flexbox is not gonna overreach and say like all of your descendants for eternity are gonna be Flexboxes. You can set that if you want. You can tell them to inherit their display property, and then if you're a child of a Flexbox, you impose Flexbox on your children. But that's not the default. The default is just go back to flow. Just go back to pretending that this is just a text document. And that's what's going on here. So what's the remedy?
Flexbox.
The remedy is more flex. I'm going to go ahead and say if you're the child of a nav element, you should still maintain that margin, but also I want you to display flex. And now we're back to, we have that nice centering behavior. And yeah, if we look at these boxes, now they're like the same size again. That's pretty cool because we're centering them. And the default for Flexbox is with your align items property. Align items is going to default to stretch, which means that they're going to take up the full height. We actually want them to center. And when they center, it says put yourself in the center, and then don't take up any more vertical space than you need to. And in this case, it'd be fine to have them stretch and then align their contents, but that'd be more work. So we just rely on the fact that it's going to be as big as its content, and just like center that element. Does that make sense? Cool. So our nav bar is, I think, almost done, or like as far as we're gonna take it almost. We have this thing where like we've lost our margin here now. So we have this like 8-pixel margin. I think that no longer applies to like direct descendants of Flex containers. I think that applies to, I'm making like a design decision here. I think that applies to H1s and A tags. Yeah, there we go. So I've made a decision here that any H1s and any A tags are going to get that. It's probably not what I want if I'm going to like put more stuff on this page. Probably what I would do is like I would declare that if they're a descendant, not a direct child necessarily, but a descendant of a nav element, they're going to get these styles. And the reason that I don't just do nav star on this one is because I don't want the containers to also get the margin, right? Because then we'll get like double margins. Does that make sense? So we want to make sure that we're only applying the margin to the element we care about. Question? Question from Victoria. Can you say H star to target all H elements? I don't know, man. You should try it. I've definitely written code before that's like H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. I've definitely done that, so if it turns out that you can just do like H star, that'd be happy for me to learn, but I don't know of anything like that. Yeah, so how do we feel about the nav bar now? It's beautiful. Are we warming up to the Navy? Could use a prettier font, but the layout looks good. Cool, yeah. Yeah, and I trust that you know, most of the people in this room, if you can nail this part down, you can think of a bunch of stuff that you can do to improve this, to add those the shading to those happy little trees. Um, blend the colors into that sunset, right? Could add like a little drop shadow on the bottom here to make it like to give it some like vertical Z dimension depth. We could change the font, you know, a bunch of stuff we could do. But in terms of just getting practice with the layout and getting the layout, like the broad strokes of the layout right, I think we're there. I think this is a pattern that you're going to reach for pretty often. This is going to apply to when you're making like cards, like for tweets, where you have like the username over here and the handle over here, and then you realize that actually I want like 2 things over here and 2 things over here, and I need to spread them out in that way. I think this pattern is, you're going to keep coming back to this pattern. I want to get into one more layout pattern, and then, yeah, maybe we're out of time after that. Do you guys want to keep talking about Flexbox? The alternative would be we could just start talking about media queries, which I see some of you have gone into already. And I think that's like less interesting and pretty straightforward, to be honest. But we can talk about media queries if you want, and we can talk about SAS precompiler, CSS precompiler, if you want. I'm deliberately underselling those because I'd rather talk about Flexbox. Okay, say nothing if you want to learn more Flexbox.
I want SAS.
Okay, you're trolling. So I want to show you a common layout pattern. This is my, I actually have done a whole lecture on Flexbox before, which this like, you know, almost was. This is my visual for what you get with floats. I'm looking for my holy grail. Yeah, there we go. Oh, this will work. So the holy grail is like this is what the holy grail looks like. And it's like this this layout that's like, it's not even that the Holy Grail is particularly good. It's just it's like a straightforward thing to want out of your layout, and it was really hard to get back when we were pretending that everything was just like a text document. It was really hard to convince like this to do the right thing so that this wouldn't like shrink too much, but like this thing would like float up beside it, and then you could get the footer under there without, you know, it was like a real mess. And so like it was considered like a rite of passage and like a demonstration, like a feat of strength to be able to like muscle the CSS engine into like giving you a holy grail. And then like, you know, other developers would inevitably like seek your title and like come and try to take that from you and be like, well, what if you did this? What if you did this? What if you had 2 buttons there? No, don't put 2 buttons. Ah, it broke. So you'd end up with these like really brittle layouts, like just to kind of like try to muscle things into everything was like fixed and like, well, what if the window shrinks? Just don't shrink the window. Just so everybody's just going to use the same monitor, and it's going to be great. Just so we can actually build this in Flexbox using principles that we've already learned. And we've already got our navbar, in fact. We're going to say the header is the navbar. I'm going to switch back to the whiteboard here. And we're going to talk about there's like a hierarchy here, and so we need to map what's going on in this layout to the idea that Flexbox just arranges things either in a column or arranges them in a row, right? So we need to break this down into like nested boxes, and like nested boxes arranged in a column, and then inside of those boxes we have them arranged into rows. Inside of those we might have like further columns and rows. And it turns out it's not that bad. Does anyone want to take a shot at driving while we design this?
Sidebar 1 article and sidebar 2 are a horizontal
That wasn't exactly what I asked, but you're right. Is it? Are you volunteering?
Why are you giving me a marker to type in the computer?
Well, we're gonna draw it.
We're gonna draw it?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a design exercise, not an implementation exercise. I won't make you implement it, but I want to think like, how do you translate this drawing into a flexbox hierarchy?
What is it, sidebar? Yeah. So it's gonna be one flex box going this way.
It's going to be a flexbox going this way. And then what's going on here is
Another flex box that goes horizontal.
this too is a flexbox. Yeah, and then nested inside it is these elements,
Yeah.
right? And they'll just line up in a row, totally ignorant about what's going on like outside of their parent, right? Just as this element is totally ignorant about what's going on inside of this element, right? And we can do whatever we want with margin padding and aligning and stuff to get like, you know, this little bit of space if we want it, or get rid of it, or whatever we want to do. Because as soon as we go inside of a flex item, it's like a new, like, new rules, right? Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. Thank you. It's good. I was hoping someone would clap.
I've been lost this whole week. But finally, I understand what's going on in lectures. It's amazing.
Well, you nailed it. You crushed that. That's exactly what we're going to do. So what do we notice here? We noticed
There's
that
no floats.
yeah, we noticed that there's no floats. We noticed that you can take like all of your like, you have some full width elements here, and they're going to stack in a particular way, and then you have some elements here that are not full width that they need to like sit beside each other. So the way that you would think of this if we were still pretending that we were programming a PDF is, you know, this would be a block, this would be a block, this would be a block, and then these would be like inlines or inline blocks, right? And then we're saying sort of like, well, just pretend that this is a paragraph, that these are paragraphs, and then this is like some bold text, and maybe this is like, I don't know. And that's ridiculous. Makes a lot more sense to think of it as just boxes and boxes and boxes, right? So let's see how we might build that. We'll add it to this nav bar that we've been working on here. Okay, so we're going to say nav is just going to be our header. If we change every instance of nav to header, is it going to break? It is not. Those are all just like fancy words for div. So we're going to change that to header just to avoid confusion with the mockup here. And then we're going to go, what would be a good name for this like center chunk? Victoria needs, of course Victoria needs a screen. Thank you. So sorry again, Victoria. All I did was I changed, all these used to say nav. Now they say header. And nothing's changed. You're now up to speed. And we were just talking about what we're going to use to like implement the rest of this layout. So we have a header, we have a body, but we're probably not going to use body. It's probably a sketchy tag to use here. We might use section. Sure. We can use section. We might use main. We might use div. And then for the footer, we're going to go with footer. Now we refresh the page. What are we going to see?
Nothing.
Nothing's changed, right? Of course, if we go and look at what's going on, we see our section is there. It's 0 height, full width. Why is that? 0 height, full width. What should pop into your head?
Inline
Block level element.
element. Other one.
The other one. Yeah, what would we expect with an inline element? What would an inline do? Yeah, it'd be 0, 0. It'd be 0 height and 0 width, right? Because it only needs to take up as much space as its content. You have some bold text. You don't want it pushing all the other content off the end of the line, right? You just want it to like start there and stop there. And this is the footer is the same deal. So they're just like 0 height elements. But we're gonna give them some height. So how tall do we want our section to be? Now we're telling them, we're doing that like we're like laying out the canvas. This isn't going to be one of those elements that is just like, you know, like this tiny thing that like we stuff with content and then it inflates to fit the content. This is going to be like the canvas that we're going to like paint the rest of our interface on, right? So we want to define how big this is supposed to be. 60%? How about 60 VH? What's VH is the obvious follow-up question.
The unique measurement.
Yeah, so the V, the H is for height. And let me show you if I go VW, let's go background. Yeah, so VH and VW are also relative measurements. What are they relative to?
Viewport.
The viewport. Did you look that up?
No.
Is that how you knew that?
There's a V, so it has to be something that starts with V.
So it had to be something that starts with V. You guessed viewport. Good job. Yeah, so this is, you have viewport height and you have viewport width, right? So your browser is reporting to the CSS engine how big the window is, right? And so if we grab this window and shrink it, we should see this plum section shrink proportionally, right? And that looks like pretty good relative to, like, we got those proportions more or less right, I think, right? Now we kind of have the option here of just like using the flow layout for this part of the page. We could make this a flex box and make it like flex direction column here. We could also make the decision that I don't really feel like doing that. You know, flow is working fine here. There's nothing fishy going on. And that'd be kind of, that'd be fine. Question?
Yeah, what's the main difference between like VHW and just using percent? Does one offer something the other doesn't?
Oh, good question. What's the difference between VHVW and using percent? The answer is that if you go to the CSS spec and you look up like what do VH and VW do, they say we get the viewport width and then it's a proportion of the viewport width. If you look up what does percentage do, the spec says, well, it depends. And then there's like 1,000 words about the different ways that percentage decides. Like, is it like a percentage of the width that I want to be, or is it the percentage of my parents' width, or is it the percentage of it's a much more complex algorithm to figure out percent. If the thing that I wanted was for it to be pinned to the viewport width, I would use VH and VW. Question?
Do elements have an acceptable VHW or
Do elements have, like in other words, if you want to say, I want you to be a certain percentage of this element?
Like, could I say, oh, get the viewport height of this text bar? This text bar changes based on how.
Oh, and like, can you say get the size of this element, and then like be the size of that element? Are you talking about CSS, or are you asking if you can access that in JavaScript? Okay. In JavaScript, it's possible to query a bunch of those things. You can ask about the viewport width, viewport height. You can select an element and ask about how it's rendered. So you can ask like how many pixels wide it is, how many pixels tall it is, where it is on the page. If like you look at the page as like this long contiguous thing that you can scroll through, where it is on the screen relative to where you're scrolled to right now. You can ask a bunch of neat questions like that in JavaScript. And yeah, it's like totally possible to dynamically style things based on that. Like when this thing has scrolled to the top of the page, do this particular thing, like play this animation or whatever. And yeah, in CSS, there's kind of limited capability to like query about what other elements are doing, because that just like throws a wrench right in like the algorithm for negotiating space between elements, right? It's kind of weird to say, like, because as soon as you change how wide an element is supposed to be, everything else goes like, oh, okay, I guess we'll recalculate. So CSS will probably never really like support like querying the size of other elements, but JavaScript totally does. Does someone want to remind me what I was talking about again?
It's not necessary to make those a flex box if we're happy about their functionality.
Oh, right. Thank you. It's not necessary to turn these into a flex box if like we're happy with what's going on. But let's do it anyway. So we have the option here, and I've seen, I've definitely seen someone do this like today, to make the body a flex box. You can apply display flex on the body. There's nothing really wrong with that, but we're not going to do that. We're going to, well, I guess there's nothing really wrong with that until there is. And then you're like, ooh, kind of painting myself into a corner here. Often it's not a hard refactor, but it's nice to just be able to like grab your content and be like, you know, what if I want to put some stuff up here? I don't want it to be like, to mess with my layout algorithm. It's cool. So we're going to make this this main here. We could go class, top level, whatever. But we're not going to do that. It's like pretty common for you to use like class names to just select stuff and just be like, you get a class, you get a class, you get a class, you get a class. I'm just going to refer to everything by class. So I want to practice a little bit with our other selectors. So we're going to go, if you're a main and you're the direct descendant of body tag, you got to display flex, right? When I refresh the page, what's going to happen? None of us know. Yeah, we break the whole thing because the flex direction by default is, of course, row. Yeah, it's horizontal. Easy remedy. We just make flex direction row, and you know that's wrong. Flex direction column. Thank you. And there we go. We're back to normal, but we're actually playing by different rules now, right? We have a lot more flexibility about like how we instruct these things to grow and shrink relative to each other now than we do if we were using block and flow. We still have to do in the section we have on a side. And those are, of course, going to do nothing. I actually want that. I actually want to refresh the page and make sure that nothing changed, right? Because that's what I like. I'm always like making a change, testing my expectations, making a change, testing my expectations. I see something happen that I wasn't expecting. I go and find out why, and then continue, right? That way you're not writing like a ton of code, losing track of what you did 5 minutes ago, and then you load the page and you're like, huh? We just make like one change at a time and then check it. And it's like super easy to do with CSS. Some stuff that you're working on, it's not necessarily easy. Like it's hard to get like halfway through a SQL query, for example, and like test how it's going, especially if you're deleting stuff. And so we have our, I'm going to bring those up onto the same line, just a little easier to read. So now we're focusing on this section. That means we can just like fold up like everything else. We fold away the header. We can't fold the main because we're a child of the main, but we're just focusing on this section now. Only section tag on the page. So we're going to go we're going to tell the aside, how big is the aside going to be? Or how big are asides in general going to be? We have a choice here. I think probably we want to say the aside is going to be a certain size relative to the content. So I'm probably going to do something like the aside is going to be 15%. So that means I'm going to have 15, 15, which leaves the article. Yeah. Anyone want to pitch me a color? So with Navajo white, just like our header items, because white is just harsh. I don't want to do that to Victoria. And then for the article, let's give it a different background color. Can someone else pitch a color? Aqua. Yuck. Let's try something a little easier on the eyes. Like Dodger Blue. Dodger Blue is easy to look at. So now what we've done is we've said this is going to be 15%. This is going to be 70%, and like that's gonna be consistent across like all viewport widths, right? So as these shrink, it gets kind of silly. So a common thing that we might want to do is give. We might say based on what we expect to actually go in these sidebars. We might say it like once you get down to a certain minimum width, just stop shrinking. Just like don't pick up the phone when they ask if you can give up some more pixels. We're gonna say maybe by 50 pixels, just stop resizing. You get smaller, smaller, smaller. Eventually, how big is 50 pixels? Well, smaller than that. Let's make it 200. Yeah. So that shrinks down to, and then we stop shrinking, right? We like hit this point where we're like, look, this is as small as I'm willing to go. That's my min width, right? So what if we turn this up to 100%? Right? Now there's like, when we're looking at this here, now this is always going to be 200 pixels wide, right? Because this element I said is going to be 100%. In this case, what 100% means, to kind of go back to your question here, is like I'm just going to keep reaching and reaching and reaching until someone stops me. And so there's kind of a negotiation going on between this article and the asides, where the article says, give me more. And the asides go, okay, I'm supposed to be 15%, but whatever you say. It keeps growing, growing, growing until it hits like its min width, and then they say like, okay, like that's it. We got to draw the line here. I can't get smaller than 200 pixels. So yeah, and let's give our footer a color just because we didn't. This is a really nice web page, you guys. This is really coming together. Someone's gonna watch this and be like, this was a design lecture, by the way. um, yeah.
Layout.
How many actual websites, how much do websites differ in their design?
How much do websites differ in their
It
design?
seems like every single one of them is basically the same.
It seems like most websites, in your experience, are like Holy Grail layouts or similar to.
Yeah, I've never, except I don't know, someone else in here showed me 3D websites which are coming out, but
Yeah, not a lot of 3D websites yet. Yeah. Insofar as most websites are 2D, I'd say that's true. Insofar as like most websites have this kind of like, you have a header and then you have like some stuff on the side. Yeah, it's like I think there's a lot of variation in that, right? But yeah, this kind of idea that like sometimes you want stuff at the top of the screen, sometimes you want stuff beside other stuff is like, is really common. And that's really all we're talking about here, right? Is like this could be lots of things. This could just be white space on the side, right? Like it's kind of common to have white space and then like have like little call outs or something on the side. This is mostly blank. This could be like your navigation here. Like this is sort of like a weirdly proportioned Holy Grail in a way, other than it doesn't have a header or footer. If we go down far enough, I don't know. But yeah, like this is kind of just a question of like putting things beside each other, which is a really common thing to want to do, and you should feel empowered to put things beside whatever. That's a good inspiring quote to end the lecture with. Anything else you guys want to talk about before we wrap up? Any questions from Victoria? Say nothing if you don't have any questions. Okay, good. Thanks, everybody. I'm here for the rest of the day if you want to pick my brain about layout and stuff. And if you want to talk about the other stuff I was supposed to talk about, like SAS and media queries. Thank you.